Column in 1916. In Cork with Sean Moylan, in Tipperary with Dan Breen. Arrested by Free Staters and sentenced for to die. Farewell to Tipperary, said the Galtee mountain boy. We went across the valleys and over the hilltops green, where we met with Danny Lacy, Sean Hogan and Dan Breen. Sean Moylan and his gallant men, they kept the flag flying high. Farewell to Tipperary, said the Galtee mountain boy. We tracked the Wicklow mountains, we were rebels on the run. Though hunted night and morning, we were outlaws but free men. We tracked the Dublin mountains as the sun was shining high. Farewell to Tipperary, said the Galtee mountain boy.
This year marks 100 years since the end of the War of Independence, or at least that's the generally accepted narrative. In truth, the war raged on in the north until well into 1922, and only abated when the Civil War reached its full bitter ferocity. The 4th Northern was the division of the IRA based in Armagh, North Louth and South Down. At its peak it had some 3,600 members and was broken down into 3 brigades: the 1st North Louth Brigade, the 2nd Newry Brigade and the 3rd Armagh Brigade. Each brigade was again broken down into smaller, more localised companies. While the 4th Northern wasn't officially established until 1921, organised armed resistance to British rule in South Armagh existed well before that in the form of the Irish Volunteers. The Irish Volunteers were formed in late November of 1913 at the Rotunda in Dublin, and as early as 1914 had companies in South Armagh. While the area initially boasted strong membership, John Redmond's betrayal, splitting the Volunteers and sending thousands of Irishmen to die in Europe, followed by countermanding orders during the Easter Rising, caused a rapid decline in membership, although the organisation never fully disappeared from the area. In 1917, the threat of conscription from Britain not only rejuvenated interest in the Volunteers, but also saw the emergence of Sinn Féin as a formidable political force. The party began winning a series of by-elections around the country, and in early 1918 Charles O'Neill, the Irish Parliamentary Party MP for South Armagh, died, triggering a by-election in the area. Sinn Féin contested it, determined to win their first seat in Ulster. The presence of the hostile Ancient Order of Hibernians in the area, who supported the IPP, as well as a heavily armed unionist community, meant Sinn Féin campaigners and supporters would need protection. Local volunteers were joined by companies from Longford and Clare. They were badly needed. It was a bitterly fought campaign with sporadic outbursts of fighting among rivals. Patrick McCartan stood for the party, and prominent Sinn Féin members such as Eamon de Valera and Constance Markievicz, the rebel countess, travelled to South Armagh to support him, speaking in Bessbrook, Lisleigh and Crossmaglen. In a last-ditch effort to stop the rise of Sinn Féin in the area, the Unionist candidate withdrew from the election, and Unionists threw their weight behind the IPP, giving them the votes they needed to win the seat. While the election had been lost, people had been impressed by the presentation, discipline and effectiveness of the Irish Volunteers. Membership in the area soared, with new companies being formed. Arthur Griffith, the founder of Sinn Féin, was quick to see the silver lining in the campaign, declaring that for every 5 adherents of the cause in South Armagh 3 weeks ago, there are now 50. And he wasn't wrong. Companies of volunteers gained astonishing boldness following the campaign. They began openly drilling and training across the area, and the search for arms was on. Meanwhile, Sinn Féin Commons began forming in every town and village. Following Sinn Féin's landslide victory in the December 1918 general election, the party's MPs declared that they would not take their seats in Westminster, and instead, on the 21st of January 1919, set up the first Dáil in Dublin. Meanwhile, 115 miles away in Tipperary, the Irish Volunteers, now increasingly being called the Irish Republican Army, ambushed an RIC patrol at Solohead Beg. The first shots of the War of Independence had been fired. The Volunteers, the Republic and South Armagh were now at war with Britain. At this stage, the bones of what would become the 4th Northern Division already existed in the North Louth, Newry and South Armagh companies of the IRA, currently under the command of Paddy Rankin, who had famously cycled from Newry to Dublin to take part in the Easter Rising. The remainder of 1919 for the IRA in South Armagh would mainly be about the procurement of arms. Raids took place on the area's big houses, such as Ballyedmond Castle and the Earl of Arran's mansion. Orange halls were raided for UVF guns, RIC patrols were stopped and disarmed, and government buildings were occupied and searched. While it is a truism of guerrilla warfare the world over that there are never enough weapons, by 1920 the IRA in South Armagh felt confident enough to go on the offensive. In February 1920, an attempt was made by volunteers in British Army and RIC uniforms to gain entrance to Newton Hamilton Barracks. While the ruse didn't work on this occasion, the IRA were far from done with Newton, and their next approach would be far more direct. In early 1920, a general order was given to IRA volunteers across the country to burn all RIC barracks and tax offices in their areas. 7 barracks in the 4th Northern Division area were razed, including the one in Whitecross, while volunteers also burnt down the Newry Customs House and all its tax records. In the following weeks, barracks in Cullyhanna, Forkhill and Mullaban were also burned down as the RIC retreated across the country from rural posts to more heavily fortified positions in towns and cities. One such position was the aforementioned Newton Hamilton, and in May the IRA returned to finish the job they had started in February. More than 200 volunteers seized the town and cut off all communications. A detachment of volunteers began firing on the heavily fortified barracks, mainly as a distraction. While the RIC concentrated on them, another group of volunteers captured the building beside the barracks and began to bore holes in the wall, which they packed with explosives. The barrack wall was breached, and soon volunteers were inside the grounds, firing as they moved. The RIC retreated back to an outhouse behind the barracks, where volunteers kept them pinned down, as others sprayed the barracks with paraffin and set it alight. It was completely gutted. In June of 1920, local elections were held to county and district councils across the country. As elsewhere, Sinn Féin made astounding gains. They were now the definitive voice of nationalism in South Armagh. Elation over the election results was short-lived, however. The next day, an RIC patrol in Cullyhanna was ordered to halt and hand over their arms. When they instead fired on the volunteers, a gun battle ensued and 3 police were shot, one fatally. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Peter McCreesh had also been hit in the battle. He was buried with full military honours, and the cortege that followed his coffin stretched back for almost a mile. Ambushes and raids continued throughout the area, but the late summer saw a number of worrying developments for the IRA. Firstly, with the arrival of the Black and Tans in August, and then the formation of the Ulster Special Constabulary, or the B Specials, in October. Both groups would go on to disgrace themselves in the area, the Tans until 1922, the Specials until 1970. On the 12th of December, the IRA made another audacious attack on a heavily fortified South Armagh barracks, this time in Camla. In a similar plan to that of Newton Hamilton, volunteers attempted to assault the heavily fortified barracks, spray it with paraffin and set it alight. Meanwhile, it was expected that British forces would arrive from Newry, but they were to be ambushed by volunteers stationed at the Egyptian Arch. Nothing went to plan. While the initial assault on the barracks dealt terrible damage, an RIC bullet had hit the paraffin sprayer, which was to be used to burn the fortification. In addition to this, the weather that night was dreadful, with howling wind and driving sleet, making it impossible to set the barrack alight once volunteers had fought their way through. Meanwhile, in Newry, things were even worse. As the British approached, one of the grenades which was to be dropped on them from the arch prematurely exploded. This alerted the British to the presence of the volunteers, and they opened up on the arch with heavy machine gun fire. Despite their inferior weapons, the volunteers bravely fought back, seeking to delay reinforcements from reaching Camla. But 3 were killed: volunteers William Canning, John Francis O'Hare and Peter Shields. In response to the attack, the British sacked half of Camla, including the home of Frank Aiken, the then leader of the volunteers in South Armagh and a Sinn Féin councillor. Mr Aiken gained a measure of revenge a few weeks later when an RIC patrol was ambushed from the ruins of his home and at least 2 of them wounded. The assault on Camla Barracks had been a setback, but worse was to come before the year was out. Little over a week after the attack and the burning of Camla, the British government passed the Government of Ireland Act, an unassuming name for a criminal deed, the consequences of which we are still living with today. The Act partitioned Ireland, creating a 26-county state in the south and a 6-county state in the northeast. The volunteers of what would soon become the 4th Northern Division found themselves on both sides of the new border. The British ended the year in South Armagh by smashing their way into the homes of Peter Mackin and Michael Smith in Belize and murdering them. In 1921, the newly formed B Specials began to make the inglorious name for themselves that would follow them around for the next 50 years. A favoured habit was raiding pubs, which would be robbed and looted. Once they had steeled their spirits with stolen spirits, they would drive around the area firing at whatever they saw. 17-year-old Felix Mallon was killed in one such drive-by as he and some friends stood outside the Clonlum Sinn Féin Hall near Armagh. Just over a week into the new year, they raided the home of volunteer John Doran in Kegel near Camla. His sister was beaten up by the Specials and his younger brother forced to watch as they shot him dead. A week later, a huge Crown Forces sweep descended on the entire Slieve Gullion area, and every man or older boy they encountered was arrested. But the IRA was not minded to give the Brits an easy go of it. In January alone, at least a dozen attacks were launched on enemy forces in South Armagh. 2 policemen were killed and several wounded in gun battles outside Crossmaglen. Another 3 were shot in Camla. An ambush in Cullyhanna saw at least 1 RIC fatality and another 2 were wounded at Sturgeon Bray. In March of 1921, the IRA was restructured into divisional command areas and the 4th Northern Division was officially formed. Operationally, it meant little difference to volunteers in the area, as the boundaries of their division were drawn to acknowledge the natural hinterlands of Louth, Armagh and Down. In April, the famous flying columns made their presence felt in South Armagh. 1 special was killed and another 3 wounded in an attack on a patrol in Cregan. A British soldier was killed in Whitecross. Another 2 specials were wounded in Clog, and the Forkhill Rectory, which was to be used to house British forces in the area, was burned to the ground. May saw a number of huge anti-partition rallies in the area, as well as elections to the new 6-county parliament in Stormont. Michael Collins, the IRA's famed Director of Intelligence, stood in Armagh, along with Frank Aiken, and claimed a seat for Sinn Féin. Of course, he did not take his seat in Stormont, and instead went to the National Parliament in Dublin. At long last, County Armagh was now represented in Dáil Éireann. While it's well known he made a famous visit to the county following the election, speaking to 20,000 people in Armagh City, what's less well known is that he then made his way to Cleavey with his right-hand man Harry Boland, where he inspected South Armagh IRA units. The 6-county parliament was officially opened in June that year by the English king, and in one of their most famous attacks, the 4th Northern in South Armagh sent a loud and clear message to George V. The British Army's 10th Royal Hussars Regiment had formed the King's Guard and escort at the opening ceremony of the Parliament. As they travelled back from the opening ceremony to Dublin via train, the 4th Northern, here at Adavoyle near Drummondhee, removed a section of track. The train was derailed and crashed down a 30-foot embankment. 4 soldiers were killed and dozens injured. Indeed, given the ferocity of the crash, fatalities were expected to be much higher. Initial estimates put the dead at more than 25. The British responded in typical fashion, and 3 local men who just happened to be in the area at the time were murdered. Less than a month later, on the 11th of July, IRA units were informed that a truce had been called. The British wanted peace talks. Volunteers around the country reacted differently. Some were relieved, others elated, but mostly the talks were viewed with suspicion. In the north, the truce meant nothing. The antics of the Specials, RIC, British forces and Unionist militias meant the IRA remained on a war footing. A gun battle with the infamous auxiliaries of the British Army took place in Cady. Barracks and buildings used by Crown forces in Cullyhanna, Tullyvallen and Whitecross were burned. Large IRA training camps were set up in Killeavy and Derrynoose. The RIC were ambushed at Slieve Gullion, and the head constable of the Specials was shot and killed in Tullyvallen. At the end of the year, the infamous treaty was signed, and partition was copper fastened. As we rolled into 1922, nationalists got a taste of what life under the new Stormont regime would be like. About a third of all councils in the north had nationalist majorities at the time, and these had passed motions rejecting the Northern Statelet and declaring that their allegiance remained with the Dáil. James Craig, the Unionist leader and now self-styled Prime Minister of the new state, sent his specials out to break up and dissolve nationalist councils. Boundaries were then redrawn to ensure that even in nationalist areas, councils remained Unionist controlled. At the next election, the number of nationalist councils in the north fell from 25 to just 2. While Stormont cracked down politically, the Specials, police and Crown forces sought to crush nationalist communities physically. In February, thousands of Specials, backed up by British troops, flooded border areas and held towns and villages under siege. But the IRA was not without backup either. While tensions grew between pro- and anti-treaty IRA members in the south, the one thing that united them was their attitude to the north. Both sides worked together to amass weapons and smuggle them to their comrades in the north. With the 4th Northern now better armed than ever, ferocious battles broke out along the border with an intensity not seen pre-truce. At Cullaville, 2 Specials were killed and at least 2 wounded in a firefight with volunteers. There were repeated battles in Derrynoose and Cady. An assault on Fork Hill barracks lasted from dusk till dawn. At Jonesborough, a war between Crown forces and the IRA raged for 3 days. Crossmaglen and Drummuck exploded into fighting as well, while Urquhart Barracks came under sustained assault. The Specials, feeling the pressure from the IRA, mobilised a group of at least 50 heavily armed men to attack an IRA post at Dungooley near Fork Hill. But the volunteers held the line and kept them back for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. The Specials had also called in backup with 8 armoured cars speeding towards the battle from Newry, but volunteers were waiting for them in Mullaban and slowed their advance. By that night, the IRA had both the Specials and their British Army reinforcements hemmed in on 3 sides and sustaining heavy losses. Eventually, fearing they'd be wiped out entirely, a British Army officer requested a truce in order to evacuate their casualties. Truce was granted and the entire invading party withdrew. However, once they had gotten out of the range of IRA guns, they began firing at random houses as they made their retreat. Having proven themselves incapable of taking on the IRA, the Specials refocused their attention on the people of South Armagh, and in grotesque fashion. Little over a week after their defeat at Dungooley, they raided McGill's pub in Drummondtee, hoping to abduct and execute the owner, James McGill, a Sinn Féin councillor in the area. McGill, who was on the run at the time, wasn't present. The only people there were his heavily pregnant wife, her mother, 2 young women who worked there, and another woman who was staying in the building. Not satisfied with their usual routine of emptying the tills and looting the alcohol, the Specials then turned their attention to the women. All 4 of them were beaten mercilessly, while McGill's wife and one of the young women were singled out for sustained and repeated sexual assaults. The 5th woman in the house threw herself out of an upstairs window to escape the marauders. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, another group of Specials abducted Thomas Crowley of Whitecross and Patrick Cregan of Bessbrook. Both men were murdered and their bodies dumped on the Lisleigh Road. Frank Aiken, then OC of the 4th Northern Division, was a friend of McGill's. He went to see his wife the day after the ordeal. I saw her the next day in the most frightful state, and I swore that if I could take it out of the skins of the men who had done it, I would. We went the following night and laid ambush for the Specials who were responsible. We shot a few of them. I'm sorry we did not get them all. Women suffered particularly viciously at the hands of the British and their surrogates. 13-year-old Margaret Moore, along with her 18-year-old sister Kate Moore and their friend Mary Conley, were walking home in Jonesborough one evening when soldiers from the Royal Sussex Regiment opened up on them. Neighbours reported hearing frantic cries of "Stop! "We're girls," between bursts of gunfire. Only Margaret's sister Kate survived. Their crime was taking food to Margaret's brother, Owen, a volunteer who was on the run. As Mrs. Moore cradled the body of her daughter, the Royal Sussex Regiment told her that her son was next. A farcical inquiry cleared the British troops of any wrongdoing. In the background to all this, plans were being made, led by Michael Collins, between volunteers in the north and pro- and anti-treaty IRA divisions in the south. The goal was to launch a huge offensive in the north. All IRA units would be active, supported by pro- and anti-treaty divisions from border counties in the south. On the day, all units were mobilised and ready, and just a few hours before the general rising was to begin, orders came through calling it off. A number of units did not get the cancellation order in time and launched attacks, only to find themselves hopelessly outnumbered. To this day, it's still unclear what happened. Some reports stated that Frank Aiken called it off at the last minute, others that he was acting on orders from the Free State, who said they would no longer commit troops to it, fearing it would provoke the British into a response. Other reports tell of fighting among pro- and anti-treaty forces on the border. Did Aiken get cold feet? Did Collins fear a British invasion of the south? We may never know. Aiken generally refused to speak about his time in the 4th Northern, while Collins would be dead a year later. In any event, the aborted rising was a terrible blow to morale, and IRA units in the north that did go out, not finding the backup they expected, sustained heavy losses. A month later, Michael Collins shelled the forecourts in Dublin with British cannons, and the Civil War was on. The 4th Northern had been adamant that it would remain neutral in the Civil War and that no fighting among former comrades would take place in the areas it controlled. Unfortunately, Free State forces did not respect the division's neutrality and they were forced into the war. They were now fighting a war on two fronts, the British to the north and the Free Staters to the south. Although surrounded and outnumbered, the 4th Northern continued to distinguish themselves over the following year. But the horror and the heartbreak of the Civil War is a story for another day. Today, we remember those who fought and those who fell in Ireland's fight for freedom with the 4th Northern Division, the Fighting Fourth.
But the bravest fell, and the requiem bell, it rang mournfully and clear. For those who died that Easter tide, in the springtime of the year, and the world did gaze in deep amaze at those gallant men but true, who bore the fight and freedom's light might shine through the foggy dew. Well, back o'er the glen I rode again, and my heart with grief it was sore. For I parted then with valiant men that I never shall see no more. And to and fro in my sleep I go, and I'll kneel and I'll pray for you. Oh, slavery fled, oh, gallant dead, when you fell on the foggy dew. Oh, when slavery fled, our glorious dead, when you died in the foggy dew.